2, 1.
So we think that our burden of proof in today's debate is something that's very simple, right? So we think that as long as we prove that in the interest of America, we should have stayed in Afghanistan, we think that we already take this debate from this PM speech. So firstly, I'd like to be introducing 2 points in my speech. Firstly, I'd like to be talking about why it's in the interest of the United States, because it better protects national security and civilian security if we had stayed in Afghanistan. And secondly, if we actually withdraw from Afghanistan, it is not in the interest of the United States because this would undermine Biden's presidency, right? So firstly, how this can actually undermine U.S. national security and U.S. civilian security. So I have 4 reasons why. Firstly, we think that in contextualization, we think that there's a lot of political chaos in Afghanistan, right? So for example, in the status quo, the Taliban is taking over the government, they're taking people hostage. This is a complete chaos in Afghanistan, right? So why is this actually happening? We think that this is happening because the US is slowly withdrawing troops from the Taliban, right? We think that because of this, there's a lot less deterrence for these crimes to happen because there's a lot less surveillance in the first place. We think that this creates an unhealthy environment in which these crimes go unnoticed, in which these crimes go unchecked. We think that this creates worse political environment, and this is really bad because Afghanistan already had originally didn't have a very good environment in the first place, right? We think that this would further create the country being destroyed even more. We don't think that this is the kind of thing that we want on our side of the house. Secondly, why are United States civilians in Afghanistan in worse shape if we take this motion? We think that United States civilians that are in Afghanistan are people working in the United States Embassy in Afghanistan, or U.S. civilians who just live in Afghanistan, right? Those are the kind of people that would be negatively harmed if we take this motion, because we think that once we show to Afghanistan and to the entire world that we are not really supporting Afghanistan anymore, we're saying that we're anti-Islamic fundamentally, we think that this can lead to more hate crimes against these people, or this can just lead to things these people being in really bad shape, having a really bad reputation in Afghanistan. They can have a lot of crimes or a lot of stigma against these people. We don't think that we should subject these people to the disenfranchised state, right? But thirdly, we think that this is really bad for America because this will lead to less diplomatic negotiations, right? So we think that it's very important for the United States and Afghanistan to create Middle East relations to make sure that there be some kind of stability, some kind of connection that we can maintain between these 2 countries. And that is the reason why the United States made NATO in Turkey, or made sure that there is at least some kind of connection between the US and the Middle East. Because this is actually very important, because for example, America has historically tried to keep good relations with the Middle East by trading with Saudi Arabia through oil, trading oil with Saudi Arabia, or having some kind of political relations with Israel. But if we actually withdraw all these troops from Afghanistan, this means that it's harder for America to make further relations with the Middle East, which is very, very bad, because this would mean that this would create an environment where the ISIS can really expand, in which countries that are very unstable, like Iran and Sudan, those kind of countries can create nuclear bombs, right? So nuclear bombs, or do some kind of illegal nuclear testing that can create society in harm at risk, right? We think that these kind of situations can arise if we withdraw troops from Afghanistan. That's why we think that the importance of diplomatic negotiations is still maintained on our side of the house. That's why we're so proud to think. That's why we think that we're much better on our side of the house. But fourthly, we think that this would create a very unhealthy narrative, which would actually promote more terrorism, right? We don't think that it's in the interest of America to create an environment in which we allow terrorists to commit more crime. So why is this specifically the case? We think that by taking this motion, this would create an anti-Western sentiment in which these Middle East countries or Afghanistan countries can just can commit more crimes because there's less surveillance, less deterrence. But we already see the status quo, which how quickly the Taliban is taking over the country. Like imagine what would happen once we completely withdraw troops from Afghanistan. This would create even more turmoil, even more destruction within the country. We think that America needs to have this, because, and this is even more harmful. This is even more probable on our house, because we think that a lot more terrorist groups would take advantage of how America doesn't really make a lot of long-term commitments, and exploit this narrative, and in the long term they would create even more crimes because they think that America wouldn't really commit to them, and at the end they can still commit their crimes without going noticed. And so we think that this creates a very, very, very unhealthy narrative in which more terrorist groups can have more power. Just introducing my second point as to why this would undermine Biden's presidency. We think that in America, or we think that in general, presidents are very important, right? So we think that if we undermine Biden's presidency, this would lead to political confusion, which also means confusion within the nation. We don't think that this is something that is in the interest of the United States. So 3 points. Firstly, we think that this would undermine Biden's presidency because we undermine Biden's perception, or undermine the perception that we have of Biden, right? So we think that in general, United States civilians think of Democrats or Biden in general as being nice, as being the person who creates bonds instead of actually breaking bonds, right? So we think that once Biden damages his perception by making the political stability of Afghanistan worse, we think that he can gain less support also within the Democrats, but also in general. We think that this is very, very harmful because we need long-term strategy in order to make sure that we can have more stability within the country, right? Within Afghanistan and the United States. Secondly, we think the opposition parties can exploit the fact that Biden's getting that support and sensationalize the media, which can create more political chaos. But thirdly, why is this so important? We think that it's very important because we need a long-term strategy, a long-term commitment from the United States through political stability to make sure that we have at least some kind of Middle East relations. We think that this is only possible when we have stability within the United States itself. So we think that at the point at which if we withdraw troops, this will not only create turmoil within the United States, but also within Afghanistan and the world in general. We're so proud to stand on side of
I would like to address 3 issues in this debate. First of all, practical impact on Afghanistan. Secondly, implication for Biden's presidency. Number 3, about principal responsibility, how abandoning responsibility undermines the United States security in the long term. So firstly, about the impact on Afghanistan. So the previous speaker laid down a lot of analysis. So I'd like to give 3 responses back. Number 1, the first rebuttal from the other side of the house is that the presence of U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan has not been successful so far. So what is this definition of success in the first place? We believe at least, it's not perfect, but the purpose of U.S. soldier in Afghanistan is not completely striking down Taliban and terrorism, but the purpose is at least to deter Taliban from taking over the regime. Therefore, as long as Kabul was protected, as long as policy-making process and judiciary was protected, we believe President was successful. Let's make a comparison. Right now, all over the territory was taken over by Taliban and a terrorist institution. Even city, Kabul is taken over. We believe this is much more failure compared to possible success that we have been defending so far in our history. Secondly, the leader of opposition proposed an alternative of delivering aids to humanitarian aid to civilians on the ground. But it's very likely that these humanitarian aids are going to be stolen by Taliban members and terrorist institutions right now. With the presence of military soldiers and American combatants, they can better deliver those humanitarian aid to civilians on the ground. So with the presence of US soldiers, the alternative proposed by the leader of opposition can be better implemented. And that was the conclusion. Thirdly, what leader of opposition explained is that because of the presence of US soldiers, the Taliban members are all the more aggressive. That's not relevant to the topic. Regardless of US soldiers' presence, the Taliban and terrorist institution continue to be aggressive because their incentive is to expand expand the membership and taking over the territory and spread their ideology. And that was the ground motivation for these institutions. So aggression does not happen. It's not mutually exclusive. Second issue about the Biden's presidency. The basic logic is that if we spare less resources for Afghanistan, we can spare great resources, we can increase domestic military budget spending, and at the same time we can provide those budget for other things. And I mean, that's contradiction. If you continue to spend budget for some other military outcome, then you can spare less resources for other domestic policies. So that's structurally mutually exclusive. Secondly, even if we spare less resources and budget for Afghanistan, the United States has to spend budget for some other diplomatic and security reasons. For example, fight against China and some other Middle East strategies. So in terms of military budget spending, there's not much difference between government side and the opposition side. Thirdly, about the rhetorics and narratives, and that was a very important point pointed by the leader of opposition. Well, what will happen is that if withdrawal is made right now, the rhetoric and the perception is that the Biden is prioritizing the military spending budget, money over people's life. And that is the rhetorics and logics created by the opposition party. The similar thing happened in the past. When the United States undertook military intervention against Somalia, what happened is that, US civilians were brutalized by the opponent soldiers in Mogadishu, and that was broadcasted in TV, and their sensational image undermined the public political support for intervention. What happened is the United States made a decision to withdraw all the soldiers from Somalia and let the country burn. And that outcome actually created a narrative that the presidency prioritized the money and US civilians over people's life in Somalia. That undermined the regime and that decreased the popularity and support for the presidency at that time. The similar phenomenon is very likely to happen when we make a decision of withdrawal right now and prioritize our military budget spending and expenditures rather than protection of people's life in Afghanistan on the ground. This rhetoric it will be politicized by the opposition party and Republican politicians, and even politicians within Democrats will start to oppose Biden presidency. That undermines stability of Biden's presidency. Why is this serious? Because long-term commitment is required for enforcement of military strategies and diplomatic strategies. When the stability of presidency is damaged, that damages the security of the United States in general in the long term. Before moving on to the final point, I'd like to take a point of information from closing. If you have any, but I will take you later then. Okay. Find out about principal responsibility. Once the United States undertook military invasion in Afghanistan, US bears a responsibility to enforce security in Afghanistan. Not fulfilling responsibility damages in the US. 3 levels of logics. Number 1, the reason why United States started to invade Afghanistan was because of a Cold War. The ideological battle against Russia was very serious at that time. In order for United States to expand the ideology of capitalism, United States started to fund Taliban and Osama bin Laden. So the United States made a contribution to empowerment of Taliban. So because of that, a lot of refugees were created, and United States dissolved the Afghan military, and those ex-military members became terrorist members. Therefore, because the United States created this situation, the United States bears the responsibility to make sure that security is guaranteed. On the second level, having military in Afghanistan was actually very successful for maintaining security and economic and political recovery. So deploying combatants in Afghanistan deter crimes and reduce the crime rates there. And when there was tribalism in Afghanistan, the United States tried to include those tribalism into democratic system. So this kind of like recovery process required long-term commitment, and the United States needs to spare a lot of resources in trying to recover the country. The conclusion is withdrawing military right now is tantamount to abandoning the responsibility. Why is this serious? Because in the future, this abandoning responsibility undermines future military operation. Right? The United States is imposing economic sanctions on Iran, Iraq, Syria, North Korea, and Myanmar. There's a possibility to undertake invasion into Syria, cooperating with NATO as a humanitarian intervention. In that case, the cooperation with local militia and local combatants will be impossible and less cooperative because all the local soldiers, all the local combatants and militia will think that US will betray at some point. They are less likely to cooperate with the United States and NATO when undertaking intervention in the future that damages the future military operation and security of the United States as a whole. That's why we are happy to propose. Thank you.